In Romans 9:13, it says God hated Esau. If God is love, how can God have hated Esau? Okay? As it is written, I have loved Jacob, but hated Esau. There we go. Any more? Go back one more and let's do the whole question, get in our heads. In Romans 9:13, it says God hated Esau. If God is love, how can he have God hated Esau? As it is written, I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau. Great question. This person went to Vacation Bible School. If you want to be this person, you should go to Vacation Bible School or you should attend with your children or grandchildren. But let's talk about Jacob and Esau just for a second. We are reaching way back into Genesis, early story, patriarchs of the faith. And let's just talk about these stories for a second, because this is almost... when I was in Israel talking to Jim Fleming, archaeologist, he had a phrase for these early stories in Genesis that I really like. This is almost the prehistory of the Bible, in the sense that in the early stories of Genesis, you've got the Garden of Eden story, you've got Adam and Eve, you've got Noah and the flood, you've got all sorts, and it's a little bit almost chaotic how these stories are put. And what happens over the course of Genesis is that slowly the narrative that will begin in Exodus and then later through the prophets begins to emerge when we think of things like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and these stories. And so the Bible kind of launches into a more consistent narrative as Genesis goes along. The reason I say this is that this Jacob and Esau story is disturbing. It is. It's a parent playing favorites. It is. It is one where, at least according to the story, God blatantly shows favoritism over one over the other. And there's sort of two ways we can kind of look at this. One is to acknowledge the truth and honesty of the story, and that this is kind of true in our lives too. God just blesses certain things at certain times. And that may or may not, resonate with what we think God ought to do. And so it may be benefit us to just kind of say, God does bless certain things at certain times, and that is God's prerogative. My mom and I have this theological conversation that my mom always wants God to be fair. That's not fair if God chooses one person or the other. And I always counter to her, it's like, do you really want a God that's fair? And she'll say, yes. And I said, so you're telling me you want a God that gives you what you deserve? Then she's real quiet. So we have to be careful not to interpret this story in a way that doesn't give God the freedom to be the Almighty that God is. So that's just kind of one check. Another is that these Jacob and Esau characters, I'm going to refer to them that way for a second, may be representative of culture. In other words, the story is not just telling us a story about Jacob and Esau. The Genesis narrative is trying to tell us a story about how Israel is developing, how Israel's relationship with God is changing. And so one of the things that might be going on, and I'll answer this, I'll probably say this at 8:45. I don't know if I'd say this to the sinners at 11 or not. I just have to think about that for a second. But Jacob is sort of the civilized mama's boy, right? The kid who grows up in the city. And Esau is sort of the hunter dude guy, right? He's out, in the forest gathering game. And so Israel kind of went through an identity crisis because Israel started off as a collection of tribes that wandered. And so they would have survived like Esau did. But they had to transition when they entered into a land of milk and honey into a more stable agrarian kind of society. In other words, they started off like Esau and then became like Jacob. And that civilized way of living is what prevailed over time. And so the story in Genesis is telling us something that happened within the civilization of Israel. And so if we read this story, we think of it as just a guy named Jacob and a guy named Esau. I think that's incorrect, in the sense that we have to recognize that these people are symbols of what was going on within the Israel culture itself. The Romans 9 passage is Paul. And so, when you think about this, I think we have to kind of marry it too with what was going on in the Paul, in the sense that one of the fundamental dynamics of Paul and his ministry is that there were those who accepted Jesus and those did not. And Paul would want to say, and this is controversial, that if we see what God is doing in real time and we recognize who Jesus is, it's because we've been blessed, right? The Holy Spirit is at work in us and we see what God is trying to do. And in Paul's day, just like ours, there were people who got it and there are people who don't. And there are consequences for that. So I'd kind of want to say that, back away, especially in today's world. I don't want to say, and I'm not sure Paul would either, that God hated Esau. But I think the deeper point that Paul is driving at is to say there are those who recognize what the Holy Spirit is doing in their day and those that don't. And we have to make sure that we are those that do, because we don't want to be found not recognizing what the Holy Spirit was trying to do in our day.